to this episode of Al's Garage. Today we're going to be working on a 2014 Ford Fusion, and we're going to be doing a transmission fluid change. The transmission that is in this car is a 6-speed automatic, which is a 6F35. Now that's mated to the 1.5 liter 4-cylinder engine option. With this car, I was thrown for a loop a little bit when I started researching it. In the book, under 6F35, I was researching it under the Haynes manual, and it said stuff about the dipstick. Well, I'd changed my fluid in the past, and I knew that this car didn't have a dipstick. So what I discovered was that there are 2 generations of 6F35s that went in these Fusions. The version that we're going to be working on is the 2nd generation, which started when this car was redesigned in 2013 and goes until the car was discontinued in 2020. So just to keep in mind, that's what we'll be working on. Another thing to keep of note is the recommended manufacturer maintenance schedule says that the transmission fluid should be changed every 60,000 miles. I change mine every 30,000 miles because there's a filter inside the transmission, and if that gets clogged or dirty, the only way to change it is to actually pull the transmission and take it apart to get to that filter. So it's such a headache. Plus, these transmissions inherently have had a kind of mixed reputation, unfortunately. Mine has been fine. There's tons of these driving on the roads, and those are all fine. So if you can change your transmission fluid as often as possible, it will help you out in the long run if you're keeping this car for a long time, which I'm going to try to. Anyway, let's get this thing started, and we'll start by showing you the tools that you need for this job. So here's our tools. We have an 11 and 14 millimeter socket with the ratchet to go with it. We have our T30 Torx head screwdriver, a headlight, and a shop light. We've got our catch basin for our transmission fluid, our funnel to put in our transmission fluid, and our transmission fluid, which is 10 quarts of Mercon LV. We have a jack and cross wrench. We'll be removing one of the front wheels. We also have our front and rear ramps with our level, and we'll show you that process later on. That's for properly filling the transmission. We also have a little compressed air and paper towels. So with all that, let's get the car up on ramps, and we'll be removing the splash shield underneath the engine bay. It's going to take 11 of those Torx head screws to come out before the thing comes off, and you can see me doing that right now. Here's the underside of the engine, and what we're looking for is the transaxle, which is on the driver's side. And we're looking for our plug, which is right here in the middle. This is still a little warm since I warmed up the vehicle, but we're going to go ahead and pull our plug, left to loosen, of course. And as I'm pulling it, I've now gotten to the point where I should be able to take the rest of it by hand. But what I'm going to do is, as I'm undoing it here, I'm pushing in, pushing, and when I get to a certain point where I know the plug is all the way done, I'm just going to pull it away like this. And that minimizes the amount of fluid that I get on my fingers. And as you can see, this fluid is pretty dirty. It's not as bad as I've seen in the past. This isn't my fluid change that is, the longest between. I think one time I went about 60,000 miles when I started doing maintenance on this car, but the fluid looks okay. If you pull this plug and it's black or it has like a burn smell to it, that's definitely indication that it's time to replace this. So this will take a little while to drain. While this is draining, we're going to get up to the top side of the engine and pull the filler cap. Let's go. Here's the engine bay and the air cleaner. Our vent cap is right under here under this radiator hose. And before I pull the cap off, I like to hit it with a little compressed air. You can find this at any office supply store. The goal here is to break loose and get rid of any dust or particles that might fall into the transmission when I pull that cap off. We want to try to get the longest life out of our transmission, and having dirt fall in there is not conducive to that. So let me do that right now. Okay. We're going to slide the radiator hose to the right and get in there. And it should just lift right off. Okay. And here it is. We'll get that nice and clean. Again, it lifts off, it doesn't thread off, so let's get that clean, and I'm going to install the funnel right now. And here's the funnel installed into the top of the transmission. There's a rubber neck that the filler cap and vent cap plug into, so it's actually pretty easy to get that to fit around this funnel. Just make sure when you install this and you're going to fill it up with fluid that the funnel itself is clean, like if it was sitting on a shelf. Make sure that all the dust and any dirt or any particulates are not in the funnel when you fill the fluid, because obviously that's going to decrease the life of your transmission, which is what we're trying to avoid. So let's go underneath and install our plug. So let's install our plug. Keep in mind that I did add some sealant to the threads of this plug. You can also use Teflon tape. Just make sure that you don't use too much. You don't want any of that getting up into your transmission. So as far as the torque rating on this, we're looking at 115 inch-pounds, which, just to give you kind of a perspective, that's like about 10 foot-pounds. Really, it's a light amount. And that's why when I tighten it here, I'm using the front part of my ratchet and not the back part. You want to make sure that your leverage isn't going to tighten it too tight. You don't want to strip the threads out. You don't want to crack the housing. This is aluminum, so it would be easy for you to have something like that happen, and you try to want to avoid as many oh crap moments as possible, especially on a job like this that you're trying to do that improves the car. Okay, and that's it. Snug, and then I just went a little bit more, and really that's it. That's all that you need. So we're going to put the splash shield on the bottom and go from there. With the plug and splash shield installed, it's time to put fluid in our transmission. Now, other transmission fluids may say that they meet or exceed OEM spec, but Mercon LV by Motorcraft was what was in this car when it rolled off the assembly line, and it's what I like to use and what I recommend you use. In fact, when you pull the cap, it says on the cap, use Mercon LV. So if that's not an indicator, I don't know what is. 10 quarts cost me about $90, which was pretty expensive in my opinion. But if you consider the cost of pulling your transmission prematurely, I would say that this is more than worth it as far as an investment in a long-term use of your transmission. So let's get this filled. Since the filler cap in this case is also the vent port, there's not an additional vent. when I put this stuff in, it'll take a while for it to, settle in and drain down, which is fine. So let's get started. Now that we have our 4.5 quarts added, our next step is to get in the car, start it up, and take it for a quick drive. We're trying to bring the transmission temperature up to full heat, and setting it at idle isn't enough. It actually has to be driven. And the reason that we want to do this is to properly check the fluid. It has to be brought up to full heat based on the way that the transmission fluid works and the different compartments and capacities and stuff in there. You just want to make sure that you take it for a quick drive. Here I am doing that and bringing it back and taking the time to get it up to that full heat. It was a mild day, so I only did maybe 10 minutes of driving. If it's super cold, you may want to do 15 minutes of driving to get it up to full heat. But when you get that done, then you can get the car to a point where it is level, pull the leveling plug, and check it. So while the car is still running with a parking brake on, I took the car and got jack stands, or well, in this case, ramps for the rear wheels, and I'm putting those on. So you can potentially do this without ramps, but I like to get a little room underneath me, which is why I use the ramps in this case. So you can see, here's my level, here's my dirty camera lens, but I was able to, figure out, okay, my car's at pretty much level, not 100%, but level enough for us to fill the fluid here. And then from that point, you want to pull the driver's side wheel, which will gain you access to the leveling plug. And now I'm just double checking my level to make sure that the car is still at the place where it needs to be. Now, some of you have your leveling plug on the back side of the CV axle right there, but for my application, it is in the front of the CV axle, right in this location. And our next step is to take our 14mm socket and our ratchet, break that loose, and remove our leveling plug. Once we remove that, you should see our fluid coming out. Again, with 4.5 quarts added, you should expect to see some fluid come out when you pull that plug here. And now that you can see it coming out, one of the things I didn't do was remove my splash shield underneath. There's a hole underneath, right under where the leveling plug is. It was my experiment. And as you can see, it didn't work very well. I thought the fluid would drain out without hitting that splash shield, but next time I do it, I will pull that splash shield back off. Just a lesson for you guys. But once your transmission gets pretty close to here, where the level of fluid that's coming out has pretty much stopped, leveled out, it's again, with the engine running still, you can see that we're pretty much at a place where the level of the fluid is at the bottom of the level of that hole. So we'll at this point put the plug back on and tighten it down. The torque tightness for that is 26 foot-pounds. There's a little gasket on the back side of that transmission plug, that leveling plug, so you don't necessarily need to put any gasket sealer on this one, but essentially, tighten that down, get it tight, and you're done with that step. And once that's done, feel free to put that driver's side front wheel back on. Be sure to tighten those lug nuts in a cross-hatch pattern as you see me doing. Make sure the torque rating on those is 100 foot-pounds. I'm using a cross wrench and I have a pretty good idea as to what that 100 foot-pounds is. So, if you need a torque wrench on that, certainly do that. And then finally, of course, remove your rear ramps, remove the jack from the rear, and then drive the car off those front ramps to complete it. So that wraps up our fluid change for our 2014 Ford Fusion with a 6F35 transmission. The amount of fluid, as you saw, was only 4.5 quarts that we actually put in. The total capacity for this transmission is 9 quarts. Now, what I'm going to do is, after driving this for about a day, I'll swap the fluid out and do this whole exercise again, which will further dilute the old fluid in the system. I hope this video was helpful. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. We'll be doing a lot more videos on the maintenance of this car in the future. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.